behind the scenes, many people came to me and say, he's a strategic asset, Eisenkot. And we're talking about strategy, so great expectations from you. We heard the Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz. He spoke about the challenges and the activities in the last few months or years, especially around Iran. He spoke mainly about Iran. He spoke about a few new things that he elaborated on. And the question is, when we talk about what is the strategy needed for Israel, do you find in what Benny Gantz said, or the efforts that the government is making today, does it correspond to a document that you wrote in August 2015? You worked on it for almost a year, where as a chief of staff, you actually spoke about the strategy of Israel. Of course, there's a tension between politics and military strategy, but to what extent what the Minister of Defense said, does it resonate, your article from 2015? National security is a major subject since the beginning of the state until today. Threats and challenges, they were, they are, and they will be. When I look back at 2015, where there was a strategic turnaround in the signing of the 6 countries on the nuclear deal, I'm asking myself what has changed. No question that the situation is more severe today. First of all, the Iranian nuclear threat, the fact that the United States withdrew in 2018 and released them from their chains and brought Iran today to the advanced stage in their nuclear plan. The second component was a threat from the last few years, and that is the precision. We're talking about UVAs, and the third threat, which has been enhanced in the last few years, and I think it will continue, and that is the cyber threat, the capability to attack. In cyber, you don't need borders, you just need capability, and we've been experiencing it lately in the fact that Israel doesn't have a national perception, and we never had a real security formal perception. The founding fathers had their own perception at the time, but I think that the threats have changed to such an extent that they compel us to update the perception and to create a national security plan with a vision to Israel and an inspiration to the heads of the security systems or health or education or anything. We see that national security is also health and education and economy, and therefore we have a half-full glass and a half-empty glass. I didn't hear what the Minister of Defense said, but the threats are expanding, they're changing. Some of them, they changed for the worse, and others have changed for the better. So the question is then, by the way, that document of 2015 was updated in 2018, and part of the DNA of this document is the need to change it. Namely, it's going to change from time to time, but still, if we talk about method, what came first? You create some sort of a perception. You say that today they're missing it. A security perception into which you put in the activities, the actions according to threats and the situation at that time. Namely, you need some sort of a framework. How does it work? And what is the final objective or the ultimate objective to your security perception? The fact that the heads of organizations, and after me, additional people came to write the strategy of the organization. I think it's not a good idea, because the Israeli leadership should consolidate a national security perception and define the order of priorities and how you build not just on security. When we created it, we assumed what were the national interests of Israel, and from that derived many subjects to have such a compass to what we do, like how to exert force of the army, building the force, and also something very sensitive of the relations between army and society, which states that the most important thing for the IDF to actually realize its force is trust of the Israeli society. But today I'm quite concerned about the fact that only 67% of the young people are recruited to the army, and only 70% end their service. And I think the most important component is the national resilience of the Israeli society, solidarity. And when you look back 30 years and you see what were the data and where we are today and where it can get to, unless there's a real change in their wish to create a new social contract among all the populations in Israel, I think we should be concerned. And it's not instead of relating to all those external threats that we heard this morning. The logical challenges is that when you approach the political echelon to formulate it, they're political, and of course then the definition of objectives changes accordingly. And I don't want to say that the tail wags the dog, but the military should go in a different way to change its perceptions from time to time. I think that it puts the responsibility on the heads of organizations. They act according to the government and according to the law. That compels a great responsibility. I just saw Ephraim Halevi, the former head of Mossad. I met him in 1999. I was appointed the military secretary of the PM, and the first meeting in the bureau of the head of the Mossad was to talk about the Iranian threat. It came from grassroots. This was way before, but it brought about a discussion and allocation of resources, and since then all the prime ministers contributed to prevent an Iranian nuclear. But I think that the heads of the organizations have a real responsibility and also a contribution, but still, in the good order of things, it should be under a definite strategy which is dictated from top to bottom. So how do you define strategy? How can you implement it in the tension between the government, which is political, and the operational, which are the organizations? And we're talking, of course, about Mossad, Shabak, etc. How can we define the strategic evaluation if we talk about the need for security perception, but this is a strategic experiment when you have to cope with it? What do you think is, what is it, the battlefield or the political field? Where do we fight? When you talk about strategic decisiveness, it's usually tactical and operative. But this is already a concept that is already rooted in the security perception. And there were greater people than me, and I go back to Jabotinsky, who wrote in 1923, The Iron Curtain. He said that the environment will accept us and will despair from where they call the problem of Jews in the state of Israel, when they understand that they don't have the capability to do it through war or weapons. And there are two additional theories. One, that the state of Israel cannot prevail with military power over the Arab world. But the second one is, without a strong army, there'll be no redemption to the State of Israel. It was said today, in the past, and it's said today. When we look at the modern wars of the last 2 decades, we see the complexity. The comprehensive war between 2 fronts was the Yom Kippur War. And the pattern of fighting in the last 20 years is in one front vis-a-vis a relatively weak enemy. From 2008 and 12 and 14, war in the Gaza Strip. The issue is whether we prevailed in these wars, yes or no, and if we think about 67, and we see today that the reality has changed. We are still required to end wars with great advantage in order to push away the next war and to enable Israel to breathe normally. But when we go back to the Gaza Strip, we see the same problem time and again of defining the goals of the war. And that's the government. The government tends not to define the goals. So they call it in different names, but it's difficult to judge. But it's a question of a decision. What do you require from an army? And the difference between decisiveness and victory, I think that the decisiveness is tactical and victory is strategic. Did the army actually materialize the goals of the government? And the other question is the strategic situation of the State of Israel has improved along the years? And after the 4 rounds in the Gaza Strip or any other wars or campaigns, you can call it whatever you want, you can look at it with a critical eye and to ask where is the challenge and to understand it, so that we don't remain in the world of hints. Let's be more precise. There is no victory, there's no decisiveness in the Gaza Strip, but Gaza is very, very complicated. There's many, many other things. How do you take this, all the sum of these parts, and eventually reach security perception and to actually have strategic victory or prevalence or whatever you want to call it? What? Humiliating the enemy or come to an understanding? And this is already another level that has nothing to do with missiles or tanks or infantry. In a theoretical state, the situation should be that we have definite goals and that the army will implement it, but it doesn't happen. There are all sorts of other complexities. Do you prevent problems by violence or not? You can dispute if you can do it in 2 years or 10 years, or maybe prevention is a goal. Is it a goal? Well, there is a strategic complexity today as well, and I think also in the future, in the fact that the State of Israel today, there are 5 major threats, and I don't think it's going to change. One is the non-conventional threat, the fact that a state like Iran will have nuclear war. The second is the conventional threat of armies, although the Syrian army can be capable in another 3 or 5 years and be ready again. The third one, which is the main one in the last decades, is that sub-conventional threat, terror, guerrilla. The 4 is cyber, and the 5th is a threat that was pushed away and all of a sudden it came to life, and that is a national disaster. Can be an earthquake or pandemic. This is one of them, with a large number of people who are dead, which is higher than all the casualties during the War of Independence. And we understand this is a global turnaround that will have an impact in the future as well. And the question is, what kind of strategy do we consolidate? I think it starts, first of all, in fingers that are pointed at us, the national resilience of Israeli society to stand erect vis-a-vis challenges, and if we do, if it's a multi-scenario threat in 1 or 2 or 3 fronts, The most important component to me is the national resilience of the Israeli society, creating a new contract among all the components, strengthening the gaps, bridging the gaps. The next components is order of priorities in coping with threats. In the Iranian threat, there's no illusion. The two of the three goals of Iran is, first of all, to have a regional hegemony and the destruction of the State of Israel, and the third goal is to obtain nuclear weaponry as an insurance policy of the government there. So if there is an agreement or a deal, it's only for a certain time, but the strategic goal, the way Iran sees itself as a regional superpower, that's what they want, such a capability. So it's obvious, until there's a real change or strategic turnaround in Iran itself, it's going to remain. Other threats not going away. The Palestinian issue is here. 8 million Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and 2 million in Gaza. They see the struggle against Israel as their way to satisfy their national aspirations, religious, social, and this is a continuous challenge for the State of Israel. And the fact that there's no definition of policy out of a complicated political existence, I think this is a problem. We gain the challenge, but we create bigger complexities for the next generation. And the last point is the relations with the United States. I see in this special relations, I see that as a huge strategic asset to the State of Israel. You can have controversies, and I can tell you from my point of view as a chief of staff what huge benefits to exert force and the image of the State of Israel, and of course the advanced capabilities that give us the advantage in this area. If you talk about relations with the United States, between what we need and want and what the United States wants maybe differently, where are we supposed to understand that we have to give in? And to what extent is it correct to put investments and money for the benefit of the main threat, which is Iran? These are dilemmas that when you talk about the total perception of security, I insist we have another 5 minutes, although the bell rang. When you accumulate this entire basket, then you have to make concessions somewhere. Yeah, you see, with talking to Tali, she looks after our interests. The best answer is to the discourse that took place a year and a half ago. It was very significant around the wish to sign an of defense treaty with the United States. And the State of Israel has to rely on its own force. Without being arrogant, we have a capability that from a military point of view, it ensures our existence. We have a state and a military which is non-invincible, whether it's terror or even a nuclear bomb. The special relations is a very important component, together with understanding that defense treaty, anybody who wanted to sign it, is that we do not exert force without consulting with the Americans and getting the approval. And new Americans are coming to help us in distress. I think that would reflect weakness, but still the special relations between Israel and the States are one of the components of power in our capability to cope with a huge scope of threats beyond the aid of $3.8 billion, and the fact that Israel showed a lot of assets in the last few years for the United States. We contributed without too much noise in fighting ISIS. This was a threat on our borders. If you went to the Golan Heights, you probably saw ISIS on the fence, on the border, and anybody who knows that ISIS was very close to the border in the Sinai Peninsula, and the State of Israel never had any real attack from ISIS, although it contributed quite a lot to eradicate it. And even in things that we did, even the courageous decision of the government in 2017 to accept the recommendation of the security forces and IDF to start a campaign against the entrenchment of Iran in Syria, in the Golan, and that gave Israel great advantages. And I know all the political statements that are critical, but I think this is an example to initiative, to courage of the government to make such a decision. In 2017, we didn't know where it was going to take us, and in hindsight, the support that was given to Israel by the Americans and the collaboration vis-à-vis the Russians gave Israel a lot of brownie points for the Middle East, and also the relations between Israel, the United States, Russia, although publicly the Israeli public was out of it for many years, and only recently it came up. And the Americans understand very well the importance of the relations. And putting all the infrastructure and budgets against the Iranian threat all the time, doesn't that take away from those other issues and other things that you mentioned, which are part of the national resilience and the infrastructure without which there's no strategic decisiveness or stability? Obviously, when the State of Israel, with its limitations, size, budget, puts a lot of investment to a large threat in a faraway country, that of course takes away from the security activities and a lot of money, but the goal is to prevent nuclear capability from Iran. In 2015, we saw a great opportunity in that with all the complexity of the deal, there's a window of about a decade that Israel can allocate resources to other things with an open eye on Iran in order not to have that enable us to allocate many resources to other threats that brought about great benefits for Israel, like locating and destroying the capability of the Quds forces and Hezbollah to attack the Galilee. It took 4 years to prepare the operation, but we did it that the Quds force and Hezbollah wanted to attack the northern part of Israel. And we managed to locate it and to deal with it. And the threat that was in protective edge of the tunnels in the south, there were 18 tunnels that were directed towards Israel. We had to locate it and a lot of resources, 3.5 billion shekels, in order to create the barrier. And this threat that was very severe on the communities in the southern Gaza, and also the capability to allocate a lot of resources against the Iranian entrenchment and to really attack very important points. And Israel did not pay a price for that, including taking a major part in the fighting of a white coalition against ISIS, and actually jeopardizing this organization from Iraq and Syria, and was really on our borders. It was obvious what the next stage is going to be, but still we have huge challenges in the first circle and also in a further circle as well. Now we really have to conclude. So what are you most concerned about? Tell us. What concerns me most of all is the rift in the Israeli society. No solidarity, no mutual solidarity, the discourse not having enough resources to obtain governance in Israel, including Judea and Samaria. Yes, includes that as well. I think that the way in which the state implements the law and order everywhere, this is a component in your power. The trust of the people in the organization, in the Supreme Court, the police, and others is very low, and I think it's a terrible thing. That's where you have to allocate resources, and then you'll be able to cope with any external threat in a better way. Gadi Eisenkot, thank you very much. Thank you.